A Cry in the Night is a scary true story about a group of counselors at a summer camp who hear a voice crying out for help in the middle of the night. This is a true story, and even now, years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. When I was 19 years old, I worked as a counselor in a summer camp. It was really gorgeous, with wooden cabins and a lake, but it was in the middle of nowhere. The camp was surrounded by a dense woods. There was nothing but trees and canyons, and the closest town was over 20 miles away. One night, when everyone had turned in and was sleeping soundly, I was suddenly awoken in the middle of the night. It was one of those times where you wake up and you have the feeling that something is not quite right. My heart was racing for no apparent reason. I just lay there quietly, listening intently. The whole cabin was wooden, with fly screens over the windows, so I could hear the sound of crickets and the breeze blowing through the trees. That's when I heard it, a very faint cry for help. It sounded like it was coming from the woods. It was the cry of a young girl lost somewhere out in the woods. I quickly got out of bed and woke my roommate, who was another counselor. I told him to listen, and when the cry came again, we both heard it. We quickly got dressed, grabbed our flashlights, and hurried outside in the direction the sound was coming from. It was intermittent, but I could clearly hear the girl's voice saying "help" or "I'm lost" quite regularly, and quite a way into the woods. She sounded like she was in a lot of distress. The quicker we found her the better, so we could get her back to camp safely. It was dark as hell that night, and all we had to light our way were 2 puny flashlights. The girl was out there in the pitch black with no way of seeing anything at all. The boys' cabins were on one side of the lake and the girls were on the other. On the way, we ran into a female counselor. She had heard the cries too from her side of camp. All 3 of us headed into the woods together, shining our torches left and right and calling out to the lost girl. We were reluctant to go too far into the woods because we didn't want to get lost in the darkness. Whenever we called out to the girl and heard her respond, it sounded like she was quite far in. After walking for about 5 minutes, we could hear her crying and sniffling, so we knew we were close. It sounded like she was only a few feet away, and we could hear her saying "I'm scared." "Where am I?" in a low voice. We kept trying to reassure her, and just when we felt we were right beside her, she suddenly went silent. "We're here." "Where are you?" we called out, but there was no answer. Then, in the distance, we heard her voice again, crying "Help me. I'm lost. Come quick." We started toward the sound of her cries, and just when we felt that we were right on top of her again, she went silent. We called out to her. We waited for her reply. Nothing. Then, from even farther away, we heard her voice again, "Help. Why can't you help me?" Something didn't feel right. We all looked at each other, and without a word, we decided to head back to camp. We called out to the girl and told her we were going to get help and we would come back with a search party. We could still hear faint whimpers and crying sounds from her, so we told her to sit tight and we would be back soon. The 3 of us sprinted back to camp and rang the big bell at the main office to alert the whole camp that there was an emergency. The camp manager switched on the floodlights and we all met in the quad for a roll call and a head count. They started by calling the names of the counselors. We were all present. Then, they called the names of the campers. All of the kids were present. Nobody was missing. They went through the roll twice and 3 times. Every single person that was meant to be at the camp was checked off and present. But what about the voice of the girl? The camp manager and the other counselors thought it was a false alarm and said that what we had heard must have been just the echoes of our own voices. They dismissed everyone and sent us back to bed. The 3 of us knew what we had heard, and it wasn't an echo. It was creepy as hell. The voice kept leading us into the woods, further and further. Someone or something was luring us deeper into the woods, and to this day, I have no idea what it intended to do to us. This was by far the creepiest thing I have ever experienced. Myself and the female counselor believed it was something paranormal, but neither of us could explain it. The counselor, who was my roommate, refused to talk about it, and whenever we brought it up, He would say it was just voices echoing, but when I looked in his eyes, I could see that he was scared to death. He just wanted to convince himself it didn't happen. The Giant Spider is a true scary story about two mysterious deaths in an elevator. In a bad part of town, the police were called in to investigate a mysterious death. A man was found dead in an elevator. He was slumped against the wall and there were 2 holes in his neck. His skin was pale white and all of the blood had been drained from his body. The most puzzling thing about it was that there were no bloodstains in the elevator, no fingerprints, and no signs of forced entry. Things took another bizarre turn 1 month later, when a 13-year-old girl was found dead in the same elevator with 2 identical puncture wounds in her throat. Her body had also been sucked dry of blood. Rumors began to spread around the area that there was a vampire on the loose. The people who lived in the building were in a panic and refused to use the elevator. The police were under pressure to get to the bottom of the mysterious deaths, so they staked out the apartment. A detective and a sergeant were posted inside the elevator, riding it up and down for days. On the 3rd day, the elevator suddenly shuddered to a halt and the lights went out. The 2 men were plunged into darkness. They pulled out their flashlights and contacted their colleagues by radio to let them know they were trapped. There was a long silence. Then, they heard a strange click, click, click sound. It seemed to be coming from the roof of the elevator. Their hearts began beating fast as they realized something big was crawling around up there. That's when they noticed a hole in the roof where a panel has fallen away. The detective aimed his flashlight at the gap and had to fight back sheer terror when he saw something peering through. It was a small, hairy head the size of a fist, with 8 black, shining eyes. The sergeant was claustrophobic and also had a deathly fear of spiders. He flew into a panic and dropped his flashlight. Suddenly, the enormous spider sprang into the elevator and landed on the sergeant's face. It sank its jaws into his cheek and started sucking out his blood. The sergeant was screaming and, for a moment, the detective was paralyzed. Then, he took out his gun, aimed and fired. The first shot blew off one of the spider's hairy legs. The sergeant stopped screaming and his body collapsed to the floor. The wounded creature raced up the wall and the detective could feel its bristly hairs as it rushed past him and escaped out the hatch. When their colleagues managed to open the doors of the elevator, they found a nightmarish scene. The sergeant's corpse lay slumped against the wall and the traumatized detective was curled up in the corner. The army was called in and they destroyed the spider with a flamethrower, but then they discovered that it had laid eggs at the top of the elevator shaft. Authorities moved quickly to hush up the incident, but news leaked out in a Turkish newspaper, which claimed the giant spider was mutated by the radioactive fallout from the Chernobyl nuclear plant disaster. People denied this and claimed the story was an exaggeration. Is the story true? There's no way to tell for sure, but it's something to think about if you're ever stuck in an elevator. Green eyes. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived with her mother and grandmother. The grandmother was very ill and spent her final days in bed while the girl and her mother took care of her. One night, the grandmother suddenly sat up in bed and grabbed hold of the young girl's arm. "Do not use the old green record player," the old woman hissed. Then she lay back down, closed her eyes and died. The girl and her mother buried the old woman in the cemetery. After the funeral, the mother said to the girl, "You must respect your grandmother's dying wish and never play with the green record player." Unfortunately, the girl was very disobedient and didn't listen to her mother. One day, while the mother was at work, the girl took out the green record player and started playing a record. Instead of music, there was just static coming from the speakers. Then she heard a terrible voice singing, "Run! Run! To the door! Green eyes! Green eyes! Now strangle the little girl! Surprise! Surprise! Surprise!" Suddenly, the girl heard the doorbell ringing and turned off the record player. She opened the front door and found her mother standing there. The girl was shocked when her mother held out her arms to hug her. Her mother's hands were missing. They seemed to have been chopped off at the elbow. The next day, while her mother was at work, the girl once again put on a record. Again, the terrible voice sang, "Run. Run. To the door. Green eyes. Green eyes. Now strangle the little girl. Surprise! Surprise! Surprise!" A few minutes later, the girl heard something thumping against the front door. When she opened it, she saw her mother lying on the ground outside. The girl's mother dragged herself into the house, using the stumps of her arms. Then the mother collapsed on the floor and the girl saw that her mother's legs had been chopped off at the knees. "Look what you've done," cried the mother. "You've ruined me. Now will you stop playing that green record?" The girl promised never to play the record again. The next morning, the girl's mother dragged herself out the front door and crawled to work on the stumps of her arms and legs. The girl sat in the living room, staring at the green record player. She knew she shouldn't play the record, but she couldn't help herself. She couldn't resist placing the green record on the turntable and placing the needle on the record. There was a screech of static and then the terrible voice began to sing, "Run. Run. To the door. Green eyes. Green eyes. Now strangle the little girl. Surprise! Surprise! Surprise!" As soon as the singing finished, the girl heard a knock on the front door. She tiptoed over to the door and cautiously looked through the peephole. She couldn't see anyone outside. The girl slowly turned the doorknob and the door creaked open wide. She stared in horror at what was outside. There, in front of her, reaching from the floor to the ceiling, stood a huge pair of green eyes. The girl heard a terrible voice saying, "You did not listen to your mother and now you will die." And the green eyes strangled the little girl. The end. Flip Flop is a spooky story about a young girl who hears strange noises during the night. Years ago, there was an old farmhouse that lay at the end of an old dirt road that was surrounded on both sides by cornfields. In it, there lived a man, his wife, and their 6-year-old daughter. One night, the young girl was awakened by a strange noise. She sat up in bed and listened, but she couldn't hear anything. There was an eerie silence and everything was dead quiet. All of a sudden, she heard a noise. Flip. Flop. Flip. Flop. It seemed to be coming from her bedroom closet. The girl sat up wide-eyed and stared into the darkness. At first, she thought it must have been her imagination, but the strange noise continued. Flip. Flop. Flip. Flop. After waiting a few minutes in silence, the suspense was too much for the young girl. She quietly slid out of bed and tiptoed towards the closet. She reached out for the handle and cautiously turned it. She pulled the door open and peeked inside. There was nothing there. Relieved, the little girl went back to bed and tried to fall asleep again. Just as she closed her eyes, she heard the noise again. Flip. Flop. Flip. Flop. This time, the noise wasn't coming from the closet. It was coming from underneath the bed. The terrified girl screamed out for help and her parents came rushing into her room. Through her tears, the young girl tried to explain that there was something under her bed. Her parents told her it was just her imagination. Eventually, her mother bent down to take a look under the bed. All of a sudden, something grabbed her by the hair and pulled her under the bed. The little girl screamed and her father reached out to save his wife, but it was too late. They heard a slobbering sound and the crunching of flesh and bones. A dark red stain spread out on the carpet. Trembling with fear, the man got down on his hands and knees and looked under the bed. There was nothing there. His wife had mysteriously vanished, leaving only a pool of blood behind. He quickly grabbed his daughter and, clutching her tightly in his arms, he ran down the stairs and out the front door. When they got into his truck, he started it up and took off down the road as fast as he could. That night, her father took her to the police station and reported what they had seen. The police just laughed and said he was crazy. They accompanied him out to the house and took a look at his daughter's bedroom, but the bloodstain had disappeared. The man knew that no matter what he did, nobody would believe him, so took his daughter and left the area. 20 years later, the young girl was now a beautiful young woman. One evening she was out on a date with her boyfriend. They were driving down some old dirt roads in the countryside when she realized it was the area where she had grown up as a child. After a while, they came across an old dilapidated house. As they were driving past it, the truck broke down. Her boyfriend got out of his truck and told the girl to stay there while he went down the road to look for help. The sun had just started to set and it was getting dark. The girl began to grow restless and got out of the truck to stretch her legs. She looked at the old house and noticed something strangely familiar about it. The front door was open, so she went inside. Things seemed even more familiar. Then, she heard a noise coming from upstairs. Flip. Flop. Flip. Flop. It was all coming back to her now. She knew exactly where she was and she knew that she had to get out of there. She rushed out of the house and ran for the truck as fast as her legs would carry her. When she reached the truck, she jumped in and locked all the doors. It was pitch black outside and everything was quiet. She started the engine and tore out of there like a bat out of hell. She didn't stop until she got home. Then, she scrambled out of the truck and ran into her house, locking the front door tightly behind her. She stood there in the hallway, catching her breath. She stood there waiting, her hands clutching the doorknob, gritting her teeth in fear and straining her ears to listen for the slightest noise. There was an eerie silence. She had just stared to relax when she heard a noise coming from upstairs. Flip. Flop. Flip. Flop. The Tiger Story is a humorous scary tale for kids about a man who tells some children a frightening story about his adventures while hunting wild animals in the jungle. This story concerns my Uncle Fergus and the trouble he caused when I brought him to dinner at the house of a friend of mine. What happened was not my fault, but I am sure I will never be invited back again. This friend of mine had 3 young children, 2 boys and a girl. One day, when I was visiting his home, he happened to mention that his children loved listening to scary tales. Since I myself am a fan of ghost stories and urban legends, I decided to tell them a few tales of some legendary creatures and mythical monsters I had read about. However, my stories absolutely failed to frighten them. Then I remembered that my Uncle Fergus had, in his youth, spent a lot of time in the jungles of India and Africa, hunting wild animals. He even had a lion's head hanging on the wall of his living room. I suspected that he might have some tall tales that could produce the desired effect. Therefore, I told the kids that I knew of an old hunter who had some exciting and thrilling experiences in the jungle. They seemed to be interested, so I asked my friend if I could invite my uncle over for dinner the next day. I never expected that my Uncle Fergus would be able to tell the children a scary story that would genuinely terrify them. I did not imagine for one second that the kids would get so scared. And now their parents blame me. I cannot understand why. If you ask me, they brought it on themselves. As soon as I arrived with my uncle, the children began demanding that he tell them a story. Uncle Fergus was always ready to spin a tale and they didn't need to ask him twice. Of course, you must remember that the children had never seen my uncle before and the only thing they knew about him was that he had been a big game hunter years ago. Also, don't forget that young children can be very gullible. As he began his story, my uncle sat down in a comfortable chair and the children sat on the floor at his feet, eagerly trying to catch every word. When I was a child, he had told me about some stories about the lions and tigers he had encountered while hunting. I expected to hear the same old tales again. However, my uncle significantly changed the plot and it seems he went a bit too far. The tiger had spotted me long before I knew he was there, announced my uncle in a commanding voice. He was following me quite leisurely, as though he did not want to run in the hot weather, and knew perfectly well that I couldn't run either. Let this story serve as a lesson for all of you in the future. When you grow up, never go out into the jungle without a weapon. Even if you are just going out for a brisk walk, as I was that ill-fated morning. For on the way, I met a tiger. I heard a noise behind me, and when I turned and saw him following me, I almost jumped out of my skin. I knew I couldn't outrun him, so I just quickened my pace, but of course, the tiger was a little faster. As I hurried along, glancing nervously over my shoulder, I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that escape was impossible. "Why?" asked one of the boys. "Because the tiger was walking faster than I was," replied my uncle. For every 100 feet we traveled, he got 2 or 3 feet closer. I was doomed, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it. The distance between us was steadily decreasing, and it was only a matter of time before he caught up to me. "Why didn't you run?" asked the other boy. "If he had wanted to kill me, he would have pounced already," said my uncle. Instead, he was playing a game with me, silently stalking me, drawing closer and closer every minute. I knew that, if I suddenly started running, the tiger would have thought it a new game. He would simply chase me down and rip me apart. Even though I knew what the outcome would be, I kept moving. I didn't want to die. Unfortunately, I was only delaying the inevitable. "Why didn't you climb a tree?" asked the girl. "We were moving away from the jungle and approaching the rocky hills," said my uncle. There was no hope of finding a tree, because the tiger was between me and the trees. "Why did you go out for a walk in the jungle in the first place?" asked the first boy. "Tigers usually come out of the jungle at night and return at dawn," said Uncle Fergus. All of this took place in the early morning. I thought that all of the tigers in the jungle would be asleep. That's why I went for a walk without a weapon. However, as it turned out, I was wrong. One tiger was still awake and searching for his next meal, and he intended that meal to be me. "Why were you so stupid?" asked the girl. "You should never ask anyone why he did whatever he did to get himself into trouble," growled Uncle Fergus. "The reason is always the same. As I told you, we were among the rocky hills. The tiger was slowly closing in on me. Just when I was about to give up all hope, I noticed something between 2 large rocks at the very top of a small hill. It was a deep, dark cave. Of course, entering the cave meant that I would be cut off from all lines of retreat. But there was no way for me to flee, and the cave, at least, might give me some small chance of survival. "How?" asked one of the boys. "For example, it could have become very narrow," replied my uncle. "So narrow that I might have been able to squeeze through a space that the tiger was not able to fit through. Alternatively, it could have become wider and split into 2 passages. This might serve to confuse the tiger. While I went down one tunnel, he might go down the other. Hope springs eternal, as they say, so I went up the hill and entered the cave. The tiger followed me inside. As I ventured deeper into the cave, the light began to fade and I could hear the tiger hot on my heels. The tunnel grew more and more narrow, and soon I was crawling on all 4s. The tiger was still in no hurry, and the tunnel was still wide enough for him to fit through. It was then that I remembered an article I had read in the newspaper. It was about the skeleton of a mouse and a cat that were found during the reconstruction of an old church. The cat had been chasing the mouse. The mouse must have crawled down into a narrow burrow, and the cat could not get at it. The cat refused to give up and stayed there waiting for the mouse to come out, but the mouse was too frightened to leave. That was how their skeletons were found. The cat and mouse had remained there forever. I just had to hope that the tiger would be smart enough to give up and turn when the hole becomes too narrow. While I slowly crept forward into the darkness, I could hear the soft padding of the tiger's paws behind me, coming closer and closer. I could feel his hot breath, and the heavy stench of the wild animal filled the air. It made the blood run cold in my veins. As my uncle came to the climax of his story, I looked at the children's faces. They were listening intently. I wasn't sure if they were worried about what was going to happen next or secretly cheering for the tiger. I had no idea what was coming next. The tiger crept closer, continued my uncle. I felt his sharp claws nipping at my heels. And then I ran into a dead end and found myself face to face in the darkness, with a smooth wall of impenetrable rock. I turned around and smelled, rather than saw, the tiger. "What happened then?" asked one of the boys. "He ate me," said Uncle Fergus. "It is a ghost that is speaking to you." The children all began screaming in unison and all hell broke loose in the living room. In the ensuing chaos, glasses were broken, plates were smashed, tables were overturned, and all the fuss that happened in that dim little room was blamed on me.